Come close now, child. Pull your chair near the fire where the shadows dance thick and the truth ain't afraid to show its face. I'm gonna tell you about something that happened way back when the world was meaner than a cottonmouth and twice as deadly. This here story ain't written in no book. Lord have mercy, no. It's carved in flesh and bone, whispered through generations like a prayer that won't let go. You see that old magnolia tree out yonder? How it stands bent but not broken, roots digging deep where the soil's been watered with tears. That's how memory works, child. It grows where pain has been planted, and it don't never die complete. The name was Evelyn. Say it slow now. Evelyn. Let it roll off your tongue like honey mixed with iron. She was born down in the deep south where the cotton fields stretched white as far as the eye could see, and the earth underneath was red as the blood it drank daily. Born in them slave quarters where hope came in whispers and freedom was just a word the old folks spoke when the overseer wasn't listening. This here plantation sat like a great spider in the middle of Georgia clay, its big house perched high on the hill looking down on everything like God's angry eye. Massa Thornfield owned it all. The land, the cotton, the souls that worked it from can-see to can't-see. Had him near 200 souls toiling under that burning sun, their backs bent like question marks nobody dared ask. The slave quarters huddled together like scared children. Little cabins made of rough pine and red clay chinkin, each one cramped tighter than a coffin. That's where Evelyn drew her first breath on a night when the moon was dark and the owls spoke in tongues only the conjure women understood. Her mama, Asha, that wasn't her slave name, mind you. That was her real name from across the water. Felt them birth and pains come hard while the other women gathered around humming low songs their grandmamas taught 'em. Asha had come from the belly of them slave ships, what they called the Middle Passage, where death rode shotgun and mercy was a stranger. She still carried the ocean in her eyes, that deep, deep blue of water that swallowed too many tears to count. Her back bore the raised scars of the ship's cat-o'-nine tails, and her mind held memories of a village where baobab trees touched the sky and her people danced free under the African stars. When little Evelyn slipped into this world wet and screaming, Asha held her close and whispered words in her native tongue, blessings and warnings all mixed up together. The midwife, old Sister Ruth, with hands that had caught more babies than she could remember, shook her head slow. "This child," she said, wrapping Evelyn in a scrap of cloth. "This child got fire in her spirit. I can see it burning already." The daddy, he was there then. Big man named Kofi. Another true name from the old country. With hands like tree trunks and a smile that could charm honey from a hive. He worked the fields from dawn to dusk, his dark skin gleaming with sweat under the Georgia sun. But when he looked at his baby girl, his eyes went soft as morning dew. "She gonna be strong," he said, touching one finger to Evelyn's tiny fist. "Stronger than them chains? Stronger than that whip. Mark my words, woman. This child got destiny written in her bones." But Lord have mercy, destiny and suffering walk hand in hand sometimes, and the plantation was no place for dreams to grow easy. Even as baby Evelyn nursed at her mama's breast, the shadow of the big house fell long across their little cabin. Massa Thornfield was looking to expand his operations, and word was spreading that he might be selling off some of his people to pay for more land. The nights in them quarters were filled with whispered prayers and muffled sobs. Families tried to hold tight to each other, knowing that any dawn might bring the sound of the overseer's boots and the auctioneer's hammer. Love was a luxury they couldn't afford, but couldn't live without neither. Evelyn grew in that world of fear and tenderness, where her mama's lullabies mixed African words with English pain, and her daddy's strong hands taught her early to be careful, be smart, be ready. She was walking before her first birthday, those little legs carrying her around the cabin like she was searching for something, always searching. The old folks said she had the sight, that way of looking at things that sees past the surface to the truth underneath. Even as a baby, she'd stare at folks with them big eyes like she was reading their souls. Made some people nervous, but her mama just smiled and said, "Child sees what needs seeing." But in them days, Seeing too much could be dangerous as being blind. The plantation had its rules, its ways, its punishments for them that forgot their place. And little Evelyn, even before she could talk proper, seemed to understand that something about this world wasn't right, wasn't natural, wasn't the way things were supposed to be. The earth itself seemed to agree. On the night she was born, the dogs howled strange, and in the morning they found that old whipping tree had sprouted new growth, green shoots pushing up from the scarred bark like hope refusing to die. Sister Ruth said it was a sign. "This child," she whispered, rocking baby Evelyn while her mama rested. "This child gonna change things. Mark my words, she gonna change things or die trying." Now listen here. The plantation where Evelyn grew up was a world within a world. A place where beauty and horror danced together like lovers in the devil's ballroom. The land itself was blessed and cursed all at once. Rich black soil that could grow anything you planted, but watered with so much suffering that sometimes you could hear it groan under your feet. Massa Thornfield's big house sat up on that hill like a white monument to greed, with its tall columns and wide verandas, where the family took their ease while others broke their backs in the sun. From the quarters, you could see them white folks moving around up there like ghosts in fancy clothes, sipping their mint juleps and fanning themselves with ivory fans while the overseer's whip cracked down in the fields. The cotton field stretched out wide as the eye could see, row upon row of plants that turned white as snow come picking time. But that cotton might as well have been clouds of poison for all the pain it brought. Your hands would bleed from the sharp bowls. Your back would scream from bending over all day, and the sun would beat down on you till you thought your brain might boil in your skull. Between the big house and the fields lay the quarters, that little village of wooden cabins where the enslaved folks made their homes. Each cabin was maybe 12 foot by 14, with a dirt floor and a stone chimney that smoked more than it warmed. Families of 6, 8, sometimes 10 people crammed into them little spaces, sleeping on straw mattresses and dreaming of freedom while the rats scurried overhead. Evelyn's first memories were of that cabin, the smell of cornbread bacon in the Dutch oven, the sound of her mama humming while she mended clothes by firelight, the feel of her daddy's rough hands lifting her up to see out the single window. That window faced east, toward where they said freedom lived, though it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did them. Her mama, Asha, tried to keep something of the old ways alive in that little cabin. She'd tell Evelyn stories about the land across the water, about ancestors who walked with lions and spoke to the wind. She taught her daughter little words in the old language, words for love and strength and the spirit that lives in all things. But she had to be careful, real careful, because speaking African was forbidden, and punishment for such things was swift and terrible. "Remember this, child," Asha would whisper when the overseer was far away. "You got royal blood in you. Your great-grandmother was a queen in the old country, wore gold bracelets thick as your wrist and commanded warriors with her voice. That blood don't die just 'cause we're in chains. It just waits for its time." Evelyn would listen with them big eyes wide, storing up every word like treasure. She was a quiet child, watchful, always noticing things other folks missed. She saw how her mama's hands shook sometimes when she talked about the old country. She saw how her daddy's jaw tightened when the overseer rode by on his big horse. She saw how the other women looked away when certain white men came around the quarters. Her daddy, Kofi, was what they called a field hand, one of the strongest workers on the whole plantation. He could pick more cotton than any two men combined, and when harvest time came, he worked from first light till the stars came out, his back straining under the heavy sack. But strength could be a curse just as much as a blessing in them days, 'cause it made you valuable, and valuable slaves didn't get sold easy. Kofi taught little Evelyn things too, how to read the weather by the way the birds flew, how to find water by watching where the animals went to drink, how to move quiet through the woods without breaking a twig. "Might need these things someday, baby girl," he'd say, not saying why, but knowing she understood. The other families in the quarters became like extended kin. There was old Uncle Moses who'd lost 3 fingers to the cotton gin. but could still carve toys from corn cobs that looked like real animals. There was Aunt Sarah, who knew every plant in the woods, and which ones could heal and which ones could harm. There was young Benjamin, who'd been born on the plantation, same as Evelyn, and dreamed of learning to read someday. On Sunday evenings, when the work was done, folks would gather in the little space between the cabins. Someone would pull out a banjo made from a gourd and some strings, and they'd make music that came up from the soul. The old folks would tell stories, some about Br'er Rabbit and his tricks, some about Moses leading his people out of bondage, and some about places across the water where black folks walked free. But even in them moments of joy, the shadow of the big house fell long. The overseer, Mr. Grayson, was a lean, mean man with pale eyes like chips of ice and a disposition meaner than a stepped-on snake. He rode through the quarters regular, looking for any excuse to use that coiled whip he carried on his saddle. Said he was keeping order, but everybody knew he just liked the power. Evelyn was maybe 2 years old when she first saw what that whip could do. Young Benjamin, sweet dreamin' Benjamin, had been caught with a piece of paper he'd found trying to make sense of the marks on it. Mr. Grayson tied him to that old oak tree at the edge of the quarters and laid into him with that whip till the blood ran down like rain. Evelyn watched from her mama's arms, her little fists clenched tight. She didn't understand all of what was happening, but she felt it. The wrongness of it, the terrible unfairness that made her stomach turn and her heart pound. Her mama held her close and whispered, "Don't you look away, child. Don't you ever look away. Remember this." That night, Asha rocked her daughter and sang her a lullaby in the old language, but it sounded more like a war song than a bedtime tune. And little Evelyn fell asleep dreaming of fire and freedom, not knowing that one day them two things would become the same in her mind. The seasons turned, and Evelyn grew like a wild thing in spite of the chains around her world. She learned to walk quiet, to listen careful, to see everything while appearing to see nothing. She learned the rhythms of the plantation, when to be visible and when to disappear, when to speak and when to hold her tongue. But mostly, she learned to remember. Everything her mama told her about the old country, everything her daddy taught her about surviving, everything the other folks shared about keeping your spirit alive when your body wasn't your own. She stored it all up in her heart like seeds waiting for planting time. 'Cause even at that young age, something in Evelyn's spirit knew that remembering was gonna be important. That one day, all them lessons and stories and warnings would come together into something powerful, something necessary, something that would make the very ground tremble under her feet. The devil came for Kofi on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the cotton was high and the air was thick with the promise of harvest. It wasn't the devil himself, mind you, though Lord knows that might have been kinder. It was Massa Thornfield's creditors, come calling with their ledgers and their hungry eyes looking to collect on debts that had been piling up like storm clouds. Evelyn was maybe 4 years old then, old enough to understand that something terrible was happening but too young to stop it. She watched from the cabin door as men in fancy suits walked through the quarters with Massa Thornfield, pointing and counting and writing numbers in their books like they was taking inventory of livestock. "That one there," said a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose like a buzzard's beak, pointing straight at Kofi. "Strong back, good teeth, prime working age. He'll fetch top dollar at the Charleston market." Asha went still as death beside her daughter, but Evelyn could feel her mama's whole body trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. Kofi stood straight and tall in the morning sun, his dark skin gleaming with sweat from the early work, not knowing yet that his fate was being decided by white men who saw him as nothing more than muscle and bone to be bought and sold. The auction was set for that very afternoon, right there in the center of the quarters where everybody could see. They brought out a wooden block, that cursed platform where human beings became property, where families got torn apart like paper in the wind. The sight of it made Evelyn's stomach turn over, even though she didn't yet understand all of what it meant. Kofi knew, though. When Mr. Grayson came for him with the chains, Kofi's face went hard as granite. He looked back at his wife and daughter one last time, and in that look was a lifetime of love and regret. and desperate hope. "You remember what I told you, baby girl?" he called out, his voice carrying across the quarters clear as a church bell. "You remember. And you stay strong. Your daddy loves you more than the stars love the sky." They chained him to the block like he was some kind of wild animal, iron shackles around his wrists and ankles. The auctioneer was a fat man with a red face and a voice that could be heard 3 counties over. He started his spiel about prime breeding stock and strong constitution, words that made Evelyn's mama weep bitter tears into her apron. The white folks gathered around like vultures circling a carcass. Planters from neighboring farms, slave traders with their greasy smiles and calculating eyes, even some city folks down from Savannah looking to invest in human misery. They poked at Kofi's muscles, checked his teeth like he was a horse, made him walk back and forth so they could see how he moved. "Opening bid is $500, the auctioneer called out. $500 for this prime buck, guaranteed to work hard and breed strong. Do I hear 500? Hands went up around the crowd like they was bidding on a prize bull. 500 became 600, 600 became 7, and on it went while Kofi stood there in chains, his dignity intact even as his freedom was being sold to the highest bidder. Evelyn wanted to run to her daddy, wanted to throw her little arms around his legs and never let go. But Asha held her tight, whispered fierce and urgent in her ear, "You watch this, child. You watch and you remember. This is what they do to us. This is the evil we fight against." A man from a rice plantation down in the low country won the bidding at $850. He had cold gray eyes and a mouth that looked like it had never smiled, not once in its whole life. When he claimed his purchase, he nodded to his overseer, who came forward with a fresh set of chains. That's when Kofi broke, not physically. Lord knows they couldn't break that man's body easy, but something in his spirit cracked like a dry branch. He fell to his knees on that cursed block and cried out in the old language, words that his daughter didn't understand but felt in her bones. "Nyame," he called to the sky. "Nyame, protect my family. Give them strength for what's coming." The white folks laughed at his words, thought he was just babbling in African nonsense. But every enslaved person in that crowd understood the prayer, felt it in their hearts like a flame passed from one candle to another. They led Kofi away in chains before the sun reached its peak, loaded him onto a wagon with 3 other souls who'd been sold that day. As the wagon rolled away down the dusty road, Evelyn broke free from her mama's arms and ran after it, her little legs pumping as hard as they could go. "Daddy!" she screamed. "Daddy, come back!" But the wagon kept rolling and her daddy kept getting smaller and smaller until he was just a speck on the horizon, then nothing at all. Mr. Grayson caught her before she could run too far, grabbed her by the arm, and dragged her back to where her mama stood weeping. "Let that be a lesson to all of you," he said, his voice cold as January rain. "This is what happens when debts come due. Nobody's too valuable to sell. Nobody's too precious to lose. Remember that." That night the quarters were quiet as a graveyard. Families held each other tight, knowing that what happened to Kofi could happen to any of them. Children who'd been laughing and playing that morning now clung to their parents' hands, afraid to let go even for a second. Asha didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window with Evelyn in her lap, staring out at the road where the wagon had disappeared. She sang softly in the old language, songs of mourning and memory, her tears falling onto her daughter's hair like rain on parched earth. "He's not coming back, is he, Mama?" Evelyn whispered into the darkness. Asha's arms tightened around her daughter. "No, baby, he's not coming back, but he's still with us, you understand? He's in your heart, in your blood, in every breath you take. They can sell his body, but they can't sell his love. That stays with us forever." From that night on, everything changed in the little cabin. Asha became harder, more watchful, like she was expecting the worst and preparing for it. She taught Evelyn new things, how to hide food when rations got short, how to stay invisible when white folks came around. How to hold pain inside without letting it show on your face. You gotta be smart, child, she said. Smarter than them, tougher than them, better than them in every way that matters. Your daddy's blood is in you and his strength and his love. But you got something else too. You got anger, and that's good. Anger can keep you alive if you use it right. Evelyn learned to use her anger like a tool, sharp and precise. She learned to watch the Overseer'S patterns, to memorize which white folks were cruel and which ones might show a moment's mercy. She learned to read the signs that meant trouble was coming. The way Massa Thornfield's face looked when the bills piled up. The way the other slaves' eyes went dull when the work got too hard. But mostly, she learned to remember her daddy's voice, calling out to Naomi for protection. And deep in her heart, where the white folks couldn't see, she started making promises of her own. Promises about what she'd do when she got big enough, strong enough, angry enough to fight back. The devil had taken her daddy on that Tuesday morning in September. But he'd also planted something in young Evelyn's heart that day, a seed of rage and justice that would grow and grow until it became something the whole plantation would fear. 'Cause remember what I told you at the start. Evelyn was born with fire in her spirit. And fire, once it gets started, don't like to be put out. Now I'm going to tell you about the years that followed, when little Evelyn learned to walk careful through a world that wanted to break her spirit before she even knew she had one. After they took her daddy away in them chains, something shifted in the quarters, like a cold wind blowing through, and everybody felt it in their bones. Evelyn grew from 4 to 7 years old in them shadow years, and Lord have mercy, she learned lessons no child should have to learn. Her mama, Asha, became like a she-wolf protecting her cub, always watching, always listening, always ready to shield her daughter from the worst of what the plantation could dish out. But you can't shield a child from everything, not when evil walks around in broad daylight wearing a smile. The first rule Asha taught her was the most important. Keep your eyes down when white folks come around. That was harder than it sounds for a child like Evelyn, who was born to look straight at the world and see it for what it was. But she learned, oh yes, she learned to let her gaze drop to the ground like she was studying her own bare feet, even when every fiber in her body wanted to stare them white folks down. Yes, massa, and no massa, and right away, massa. Them words became like a second language, spoken with the tongue while the heart stayed silent. Evelyn practiced them words till they came out smooth as molasses, even though each one tasted like poison in her mouth. Her mama would correct her if she forgot, not out of meanness, but out of love, 'cause forgetting could cost you skin, could cost you blood, could cost you worse. The second rule was just as hard. Don't never let them see you angry. Child, that was like telling the sun not to shine, or the river not to flow. Evelyn had anger burning in her like a coal furnace. Anger about her daddy being sold. Anger about the way Mr. Grayson looked at the women folk. Anger about the way the children in the big house got to play while the children in the quarters got to work. But she learned to swallow that anger down, to let it burn inside her belly where nobody could see it glow. By the time she was 6, Evelyn was working alongside her mama in the big house, carrying water and emptying chamber pots and dusting furniture that cost more than her daddy would have sold for. Massa Thornfield's wife, Miss Catherine, was a pale woman with nervous hands who was always fanning herself and complaining about the heat. She had 3 children, little Massa William, Miss Elizabeth, and baby Charles. And they ran around that house like they owned the world, which I reckon they thought they did. Evelyn learned to move like a ghost through them fine rooms, to be there when needed and invisible when not. She learned which floorboards creaked and which doors squeaked, learned to read the mood of the house by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. She learned that Miss Catherine liked her tea with exactly 2 lumps of sugar, that Massa Thornfield had a terrible temper when his accounts didn't balance, and that the children would hit you if they was bored and nobody was looking. But the hardest lesson came from watching and listening when she wasn't supposed to. Like the day she was dusting in the parlor when Massa Thornfield was meeting with another planter, talking about breeding stock and productive wenches. like they was discussing livestock instead of human beings. Or the night she heard Miss Catherine crying to her sister about how difficult it was to manage these people, when they looked at you with such insolence in their eyes. That word, insolence. Evelyn didn't know what it meant at first, but she figured it out quick enough. It meant looking like you had a soul when they wanted you to act like you didn't. It meant standing straight when they expected you to grovel. It meant being human when they needed you to be property. The other children in the quarters became Evelyn's teachers too, though not in ways she wanted to learn. Little Samuel, who was 8, showed her the scars on his back from the time he talked back to young Massa William. Mary, who was 10, taught her how to hide food in her dress for the days when rations ran short. Thomas, who was 12 and already working the fields, showed her how to make herself small and quiet when the paddy rollers came through at night, hunting for runaways who might be hiding in the quarters. "Don't never trust no white person," Thomas told her one evening when they was shelling peas behind the cabins. "Not even the ones that smile at you. Especially not the ones that smile at you. That smile is just the trap opening up to catch you." Evelyn learned to recognize the different kinds of white folks that moved through their world. There was the kind like Massa Thornfield, who saw them as investments to be protected but not pampered. There was the kind like Mr. Grayson, who enjoyed the power and used it like a whip even when he didn't have to. And there was the kind like Miss Catherine, who was scared of them but tried to hide it behind a mask of Christian charity and condescending kindness. The worst kind, though, was the visitors. Planters and their wives who came for dinner and talked about their people like they was prize horses or hunting dogs. They'd ask to see the children, especially the pretty ones, and their eyes would get a certain look that made Evelyn's skin crawl even when she was too young to understand why. Her mama started keeping her closer during them times, finding extra work in the kitchen or the laundry house anywhere away from the visiting eyes. "Some hungers," Asha whispered to her daughter. "Got nothing to do with food, and everything to do with evil. You stay away from men with hungry eyes, you hear me? You run if you have to." As Evelyn grew, she started to understand that the plantation wasn't just a place where people worked. It was a machine designed to crush spirits and break souls. Every rule, every punishment, every small cruelty was part of a system meant to make them forget they was human beings with hearts and minds and dreams of their own. But here's the thing about Evelyn. The more they tried to break her, the stronger that fire inside her burned. She learned to follow the rules, yes, but she also learned to watch and remember. She memorized the routines of the overseers, the patterns of the paddy rollers, the weaknesses she saw in the white folks' armor of superiority. Late at night, when her mama thought she was sleeping, Evelyn would listen to the grown folks talking in whispers about resistance and rebellion, about places up north where black folks walked free, about something called the Underground Railroad that carried people to freedom like Moses parting the Red Sea. She learned that some of the house slaves carried messages between plantations, that some of the field hands slowed down their work on purpose, that some of the women put things in the white folks' food to make them sick when they got too cruel. Small rebellions, quiet rebellions, but rebellions all the same. And slowly, like a seed pushing up through hard ground, an idea started growing in Evelyn's mind. She was learning their rules, yes, but she was also learning their weaknesses. She was getting stronger, smarter, more patient, and someday, all that learning was gonna come together into something powerful. Her daddy's voice still echoed in her memory. "You remember, and you stay strong." Well, she was remembering all right, remembering every slight, every cruelty, every moment when they treated her like she was less than human. And when the time came, she was gonna remember how to fight back. The devil's got many faces, child, and one of them belonged to Mr. Grayson, the overseer who ruled them fields like a king rules his kingdom, with iron in his fist and meanness in his heart. But let me tell you about the day when that particular devil met his match, or at least caught a glimpse of what was coming for him down the road. Evelyn was 8 years old when she first felt the full weight of Mr. Grayson's attention fall on her like a shadow from a storm cloud. It was during cotton picking season, when even the children who worked in the big house had to come out and help bring in the harvest. The sun beat down merciless, turning the fields into a furnace where human souls got baked along with the cotton bolls. Now, Mr. Grayson was what you might call a particular kind of evil. The kind that's got method to its madness. He wasn't just cruel for the sake of being cruel, though. Lord knows he enjoyed it plenty. No, he had a whole system worked out. A way of breaking people down piece by piece till they forgot they was anything more than tools for picking cotton and making him look good to Massa Thornfield. He was a tall, lean man with skin that never seemed to tan, just turned angry red under the Georgia sun. Had pale eyes like chips of winter ice, and thin lips that looked like they was carved with a knife. His hair was the color of wet straw, always slicked back with pomade. And he wore his authority like other men wore their Sunday clothes, proud and careful and ready to show it off. The thing about Mr. Grayson was that he studied people the way a snake studies a mouse before it strikes. He'd watch the new slaves to see who was strong-willed and who was already broken, who might cause trouble and who would just put their head down and work. He had different methods for different folks. Some he'd break with the whip, some with extra work, some with taking away their food or their family. But children was his specialty. He understood that if you could break a child's spirit early enough, you'd have an obedient worker for life. So he paid particular attention to the young ones, looking for signs of defiance or intelligence or anything that might grow into trouble later on. Evelyn had managed to stay mostly out of his sight for her first 8 years, working in the big house where his authority was shared with the household staff. But come cotton season, everybody belonged to the fields, and that meant everybody belonged to Mr. Grayson. She was picking cotton alongside her mama when he first really noticed her. The work was hard, bending over them plants all day, your back screaming and your fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls. The cotton sack got heavier and heavier as the day wore on, dragging behind you like a burden of sins you never committed. Evelyn was trying her best to keep up, but her little hands couldn't move as fast as the grown folks, and her sack wasn't filling up near quick enough. She could feel Mr. Grayson's eyes on her before she ever saw him coming, the way you can feel a storm approaching even when the sky's still blue. "You there, girl," he called out, his voice cracking across the field like a whip itself. "What's your name?" Evelyn's mama tensed up beside her, but she'd taught her daughter well. Evelyn dropped her eyes to the ground and spoke in the small, careful voice she'd learned to use around white folks. "Evelyn, sir. Evelyn's my name." Mr. Grayson rode his horse closer, the animal snorting and stamping in the heat. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, girl." Now that was a trap, and Evelyn knew it even at 8 years old. Look down and you was disrespectful. Look up and you was insolent. But she raised her eyes just enough to meet his without seeming bold, a skill her mama had taught her through long, careful practice. "How much cotton you picked today, Evelyn?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been yelling. "I don't rightly know, sir. I've been picking steady since morning." He climbed down from his horse and walked over to her sack, hefting it with one hand. "Feels light to me. Real light. You been working hard, or you been daydreaming about things that ain't your business?" "I've been working hard, sir, hard as I can." That's when he smiled, and child, that smile was worse than any frown. It was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse just before it starts playing with it. "Hard as you can?" Well, now that's a problem, ain't it? 'Cause hard as you can ain't near good enough. He reached into his vest and pulled out a little leather strap, maybe 6 inches long and thin as a razor. "You know what this is, Evelyn?" She'd heard about it from the other children, whispered stories that made them wake up screaming. "No, sir. This here is my teaching tool. See, some folks learn with words, but others need a more direct education. Hold out your hand." Evelyn's mama stepped forward then, fear and desperation warring in her voice. "Please, Mr. Grayson, sir, she's just a child. She's learning. Give her time and she'll—" "Shut your mouth, woman, unless you want some of this too." His voice went cold as January wind. I'm teaching this child about responsibility, about what happens when you don't pull your weight." Asha fell back, her face a mask of helpless rage, knowing that any further protest would just make things worse. Evelyn understood then that this was bigger than cotton, bigger than productivity. This was about power, about breaking her spirit before it had a chance to grow strong. She held out her small hand, palm up, trying to keep it steady even though her whole body was shaken. The leather strap came down fast and sharp, cutting across her palm like a line of fire. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood where her teeth cut through. "Again, Mr. Grayson said, his voice calm as Sunday morning. The strap fell again and again, each blow precise and measured. By the fifth strike, Evelyn's palm was raw and bleeding, but she hadn't made a sound. By the 10th, tears was streaming down her face, but still she stood silent. "You crying, girl?" Mr. Grayson asked, leaning down so his face was close to hers. "No, sir." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was steady. "Good. 'Cause crying is for babies, and babies don't pick cotton. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." He put the strap back in his vest and climbed onto his horse. "I want that sack full by sundown, you hear? And if it ain't, we gonna have another lesson tomorrow, a longer one." As he rode away, Asha rushed to her daughter, cradled that bleeding hand gentle as she could. "Baby, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." But Evelyn wasn't looking at her mama. She was staring after Mr. Grayson, watching him ride through the cotton fields like he owned every plant and every person in them. And for the first time in her young life, she felt something darker than anger, something colder than rage. She felt hate, pure, clean hate that cut through her heart like a blade and settled there to stay. Not the hot kind of hate that burns out quick, but the deep, patient kind that grows stronger over time. The kind that waits for its moment and never forgets. "Mama," she whispered, flexing her wounded hand and watching the blood seep between her fingers. "What is it, baby?" "I'm gonna kill him someday." Asha's breath caught in her throat. "Don't you say such things. Don't you even think them." But it was too late. The thought had been born, and like all dark thoughts, once born it started to grow. Evelyn went back to picking cotton, her movements mechanical and steady. But her mind was elsewhere. She was imagining Mr. Grayson's face when he realized he'd picked the wrong child to break. She was imagining the moment when the hunter became the hunted. That night, lying on her straw mattress with her hand wrapped in rags, Evelyn made herself a promise. She was going to learn everything there was to learn about surviving on the plantation. She was going to get strong, get smart, get patient. She was going to watch and wait and plan. And when the time came, when she was ready, Mr. Grayson was going to pay for every blow he'd ever struck, every spirit he'd ever broken, every child he'd ever made cry. The devil had shown her his true face that day. Now it was time for her to start showing him hers. Listen now, child, to what happened next, 'cause this is where the story starts to turn, like a river changing course after a long, hard winter. Evelyn was growing up fast. Too fast, the way children do when the world won't let them be children. And by the time she turned 10, she'd learned more about pain than most folks learn in a lifetime. But pain, when it don't kill you, can teach you things that comfort never will. It can teach you patience and cunning and how to hide your true thoughts behind a mask of submission. Most of all, it can teach you that there's different kinds of strength in this world, and sometimes the quiet kind is more dangerous than the loud kind. After that day in the cotton field when Mr. Grayson first laid his strap across her hand, Evelyn started paying attention to things she'd never noticed before. She watched how the other slaves moved around him, how they made themselves small and invisible. She studied his routines, his moods, his weaknesses. 'Cause every man's got weaknesses, even the devil's among them. She learned that he was worse when the weather was hot, that he drank whiskey behind the tobacco barn when he thought nobody was watching, and that he had a particular hatred for slaves who could read or showed any signs of intelligence. Most important, she learned that he had a special cruelty saved up for the children, like he enjoyed snapping young spirits more than breaking grown ones. The other thing Evelyn learned was about her own body, how it was changing in ways that made some of the white men look at her different. She was getting taller, filling out in places, and her mama started warning her about new dangers that had nothing to do with cotton quotas or work assignments. "You stay away from the barn after dark," Asha would whisper when they was alone. "You don't go nowhere by yourself, you hear me? And if any of them white men try to get you alone, you run. You run fast as your legs will carry you." But there was one danger Asha couldn't protect her daughter from, couldn't warn her about, 'cause it came wearing the face of discipline and the mask of righteous correction. It came in the form of Mr. Grayson's newest teaching method, one he'd developed special for the older children who was starting to show signs of independence. It started on a Thursday morning in late spring, when the cotton was still green and the work in the fields was lighter. Evelyn had been assigned to help repair some fence posts that had rotted through the winter, work that required more skill than strength. She was proud of her handiwork, fitting the posts together neat and tight when Mr. Grayson came riding up on that big sorrel horse of his. Well, he said, climbing down and inspecting her work. "Look at this girl. Thinks she's a carpenter now. Thinks she knows better than the men who've been doing this work since before she was born." Evelyn kept her eyes on her work, hands steady as she could make them. "Just trying to do it right, sir. Make it strong so it'll last." "Strong, huh?" He walked around the fence post, pretending to examine it close. "You think you're strong, girl? You think you're smart?" "No, sir, just trying to work hard." But he'd already made up his mind about what was going to happen. Maybe he was bored, maybe he was drunk, maybe he just needed to remind everybody who was boss. Whatever the reason, he decided that Evelyn needed another lesson, a harder one this time. "Come here, girl. Leave that work and come here." She set down her tools and walked over to where he stood by his horse, her stomach already churning with dread. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out something she'd never seen before, a pair of small iron pliers, the kind used for pulling nails and bending wire. "Hold out your hands," he said, his voice soft and conversational, like he was asking her to pass the biscuits at dinner. Evelyn's blood turned to ice water. "Sir?" "Your hands. Hold them out." She knew better than to argue, knew it would only make things worse. But as she lifted her hands, she saw something in his pale eyes that was worse than anger, worse than cruelty. She saw pleasure, the kind of sick satisfaction a man gets from having complete power over another human being. He took hold of her left hand, bending the fingers back to expose the nails. "You know, Evelyn, there's different ways to teach a lesson. Some folks learn from words, some from the strap, but some stubborn ones, they need something more memorable." The first nail, her thumb, came off with a sickening crack that seemed to echo across the fields. The pain was like nothing she'd ever felt before, a white-hot explosion that shot up her arm and exploded behind her eyes. But worse than the pain was the sound Mr. Grayson made, a little grunt of satisfaction that told her he was enjoying this more than anything he'd done all day. "That's one," he said, dropping the nail in the dirt at her feet. "9 more to go, unless you got something to say about how smart and strong you are." Evelyn bit her tongue so hard she tasted copper, but she didn't make a sound. Couldn't give him that satisfaction, couldn't let him know he was breaking her. But inside, in the secret places of her heart, something was happening that Mr. Grayson couldn't see. The second nail, her index finger, hurt just as bad, but by then Evelyn had found something to hold on to. Not hope exactly, and not even anger. It was something colder and more patient than anger, something that whispered to her that this pain was temporary but the memory would last forever. By the 5th nail, her left hand was a ruin of blood and exposed flesh. By the 7th, she'd gone somewhere else in her mind, somewhere Mr. Grayson couldn't reach. She watched from that distant place as he worked, methodical and thorough like a craftsman perfecting his art. Still think you're strong? He asked, holding up the pliers to examine the 8th nail. Yes, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible but steady as stone. That stopped him for a moment, the pliers frozen halfway to her hand. What did you say? I said yes, sir. I'm still strong. He stared at her for a long moment, and she met his gaze without flinching. In that look, something passed between them. Some understanding that went deeper than master and slave, deeper than pain and submission. He saw that he wasn't breaking her spirit. He was forging it, turning it into something harder and more dangerous than it had ever been before. But he was too far gone to stop now, too committed to his lesson to back down. The 8th nail came off, then the 9th, then the 10th. By the time he was finished, both of Evelyn's hands were mangled, bloody ruins that would take weeks to heal and would never look the same again. He cleaned the pliers on his handkerchief and put them back in his saddlebags, casual as if he'd just finished shodding a horse. Next time you think about getting above yourself, girl, you remember this day. You remember what happens to slaves who forget their place. After he rode away, Evelyn stood there in the spring sunshine looking down at her ruined hands and feeling something new growing in her chest. Not pain. The pain was there, but it was secondary now. Just background noise. What she felt was clarity, pure and sharp as winter starlight. She understood now that Mr. Grayson wasn't just cruel. He was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if slaves like her ever stopped being afraid, ever started believing in their own strength and intelligence. He tortured children not because he was strong but because he was weak. Because he needed to convince himself that he was superior to people he knew, deep down, were every bit as human as he was. That night Asha wept over her daughter's hands, wrapping them gentle in clean rags and singing old songs of healing and comfort. But Evelyn barely heard the songs. She was too busy making plans, thinking about the future, imagining the day when Mr. Grayson would learn that some spirits can't be broken, only tempered into something harder and more deadly than he could possibly imagine. Her nails would grow back, crooked and scarred but functional. Her hands would heal, marked forever, but still strong. And in the secret chambers of her heart, her hatred would grow too, fed by pain and nurtured by patience, until it became something that could reshape the world. The devil thought he'd won that day, but he'd only succeeded in creating something that would hunt him till the end of his days. Now listen close, child, 'cause what I'm about to tell you is where the numbers stopped mattering and the pain became something else entirely. Something that carved itself so deep into Evelyn's soul that it changed the very way she breathed, the very way she saw the world around her. 300 times. That's what the old folks whispered when they thought nobody was listening. 300 times, Mr. Grayson called her to that whipping post, to that old oak tree, to whatever place his sickness led him when the devil got to whispering in his ear. But I tell you true, we stopped counting after the first 50. Numbers don't hold the weight of what happened to that child. Only memory can carry a burden that heavy. It started as a routine, predictable as sunrise, terrible as death. Every few days, sometimes every week, Mr. Grayson would find some excuse. Cotton picked too slow, a look he didn't like, a word spoken too clear or too proud. The reasons didn't matter. They was just the wrapping paper on a gift nobody wanted to receive. Evelyn, his voice would crack across the quarters like thunder before a storm. Get yourself over here, girl. And she would go, steady as a clock pendulum, her face set like stone and her ruined hands hanging at her sides. The other slaves would stop their work to watch, their hearts breaking a little more each time, their own spirits dying by degrees as they witnessed what was happening to one of their children. He had it down to a science by then, Mr. Grayson did. Different tools for different occasions, the pliers for when he wanted to take something away, the needle-nose ones for when he wanted to be precise, the rusty pair for when he wanted to make sure infection set in and the healing took longer. He kept them clean and sharp, maintained them like a carpenter maintains his tools because this was his craft, his art, his way of maintaining order. The ritual never changed much. He'd have her sit on a wooden stool they brought out special for these occasions, her hands laid flat on a cutting block like she was about to help prepare dinner. Sometimes there'd be an audience, other overseers visiting from neighboring plantations, young white men learning the trade, occasionally even women who claimed they couldn't stomach such things, but somehow never looked away. "Now, Evelyn," he'd say in that calm conversational tone that made everything worse, "what did you do wrong today?" Sometimes she'd answer with whatever excuse he was using. Sometimes she'd just sit silent, staring straight ahead with eyes that had learned not to beg, not to plead, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. By the 20th time, she'd learned that her answers didn't matter anyway. He was gonna do what he was gonna do regardless. The taking of the nails became a meditation of sorts, a terrible dance between the one who suffered and the one who caused suffering. Mr. Grayson would work slow and methodical, explaining his technique to anyone who'd listen, as if he was teaching a valuable skill instead of committing an unspeakable cruelty. "The key," he'd say, gripping one of her thumbnails with those cold metal teeth, "is to get a good hold before you pull. Quick and clean, that's the way. Makes it hurt more, but it heals faster, and you can do it again sooner." Each nail that came off took a piece of Evelyn's childhood with it. By the time she was 12, her hands looked like something that had been chewed by wild animals, scarred, twisted, with nails that grew back crooked and thick, like claws on some creature that had adapted to survive in hell itself. But here's the thing that Mr. Grayson never understood. The thing that his small, cruel mind couldn't grasp. Every nail he took was like planting a seed of something darker and more powerful than he could imagine. With each act of torture, he was creating an enemy unlike anything he'd ever faced. Someone who understood pain so intimately that she could wield it like a weapon. Evelyn learned to count during those sessions. Not the nails. She'd given up on that. But other things. The number of breaths Mr. Grayson took while he worked. The number of times he blinked. The number of heartbeats between the grip of the pliers and the sharp tug that sent fire shooting up her arm. She memorized the rhythm of his breathing, the pattern of his movements, the tiny hesitations that meant he was enjoying himself more than usual. She learned his weaknesses too. How his hands shook slightly when he'd been drinking. How he favored his right side because of an old injury from a horse kick. How he always stood in the same position, with his back to the quarters and his attention focused entirely on his victim, never thinking that someone might be watching him instead of watching what he was doing. By the time winter came around again, something fundamental had changed in Evelyn. She'd stopped flinching when the pliers came out, stopped crying afterward when her mama tried to tend her wounds, stopped asking why this was happening to her because she'd figured out that the why didn't matter, only the what and the when and the how. The other slaves started to notice the change too. They'd whisper about it in the evening, when the work was done, and the white folks were safely locked away in their big house. How Evelyn walked different now, like she was carrying something heavy but precious. How her eyes had gone flat and cold, like winter water in a deep pond. How she'd stopped talking much, but when she did speak, there was something in her voice that made even the grown men listen careful. "That child's got something growing in her," old Uncle Moses would mutter, watching Evelyn work in the kitchen garden with those mangled hands. "Something dark and patient, something that's gonna come calling someday." The worst part, though, wasn't the pain itself. It was how normal it became. How the other slaves got used to seeing Evelyn called away for her lessons with Mr. Grayson. Children who should have been playing started accepting that some of their friends would be tortured regular as clockwork. That this was just part of life on the plantation. Part of the natural order of things. But Evelyn refused to let it become normal. Refused to accept it as just the way things were. Each time Mr. Grayson took a nail, she made herself a promise. that she would remember everything, that she would store up every moment of pain like ammunition for a war that was coming, whether anybody else knew it or not. She started having dreams during those long months. Vivid dreams where she was the one holding the pliers, where Mr. Grayson was the one sitting on that wooden stool with his hands laid out helpless. In those dreams, she worked with the same methodical patience he'd taught her, taking her time, explaining her technique to an invisible audience. When she'd wake from those dreams, she wouldn't feel guilty or ashamed. She'd feel something closer to peace, like she'd gotten a glimpse of the future, a promise that justice was coming even if it was taking its sweet time to arrive. The nails kept coming off, winter into spring into summer, until the count reached numbers that don't bear repeating. But with each one, Evelyn's resolve grew stronger, her patience deeper, her understanding of what needed to be done more complete. Mr. Grayson thought he was breaking her, but what he was really doing was teaching her everything she'd need to know to break him in return. Child, there comes a time in every soul's journey when pain stops being something that happens to you and starts becoming something you carry, something you shape, something you turn into a tool for your own purposes. For Evelyn, that transformation came somewhere around her 13th birthday, when the seasons had cycled through enough times that she could predict Mr. Grayson's moods by the way the wind blew and the color of the morning sky. By then, her hands had become something that didn't quite belong to the world of normal folks. The nails grew back thick and yellowed, twisted into shapes that looked more like talons than anything human. The fingertips themselves had grown tough as leather, scarred over so many times that they'd lost most feeling. But in losing the ability to feel gentle touches, they'd gained something else. A sensitivity to pressure, to texture, to the subtle vibrations that told stories about what they touched. The other slaves had stopped watching when Mr. Grayson called for her. Not because they'd stopped caring, but because watching had become too painful, too much like looking into their own possible futures. Instead, they'd find urgent work to do elsewhere, tasks that took them far from the sound of metal on bone and the terrible silence that followed. But Evelyn had started watching everything else with new eyes. She watched how Mr. Grayson moved when he thought nobody was looking, how he carried himself when he was tired versus when he was fresh. She studied the way he interacted with the other overseers, the subtle hierarchies and power plays that determined who got respect and who got orders. Most important, she learned to read the rhythms of the plantation itself. When the masters were distracted by business troubles, when the mistress was laid up with her nervous conditions, when the paddy rollers were focused on some other farm where runaway slaves had been spotted. Knowledge became her new religion, and patience became her prayer. The nail-taking had evolved too, become more ritualized and theatrical. Mr. Grayson had started inviting other white men to witness his training methods, turning Evelyn's suffering into a form of entertainment for those who shared his particular appetites. They'd gather around like spectators at a cockfight, offering suggestions and commentary as if they were discussing the best way to break a horse or train a dog. "Now watch this," Mr. Grayson would say, selecting his pliers with the care of a surgeon choosing instruments. "See how she don't even flinch anymore? That's what you call proper conditioning. Break them young, break them thorough, and they'll serve you faithful for life." But what Mr. Grayson couldn't see, what none of them could see, was the change happening behind Evelyn's eyes. Each session had become a classroom where she learned valuable lessons about the nature of power, about how men like him thought, about the weaknesses that hid behind their casual cruelty. She learned that Mr. Grayson was most vulnerable when he was showing off, when his attention was focused on impressing his audience rather than watching for danger. She learned that he always stood in the same position, always used the same sequence of movements, always let his guard down in the same moments. More than that, she learned about fear, not her own, which had long since been burned away like morning mist, but theirs. She saw how they needed to hurt her to feel powerful, how they fed on her pain like vampires feeding on blood. And in seeing their hunger, she began to understand their weakness. the dreams changed too. Where once she'd dreamed of simple revenge, of doing to Mr. Grayson what he'd done to her, now her sleeping mind conjured more complex scenarios. Dreams where she was the teacher and he was the student, where she explained her methods with the same calm professionalism he used, where she took her time and made sure he understood exactly why each moment of pain was necessary and just. In these dreams, she wasn't angry or emotional. She was simply correcting a mistake, setting right something that had been wrong for far too long. The dreams were so vivid, so detailed, that she'd wake feeling like she'd been practicing for something important, rehearsing for a performance that was still to come. During the day, while her hands worked automatically at whatever tasks she'd been assigned, her mind wandered through scenarios and possibilities. She memorized the layout of every building on the plantation, the schedules of every overseer, the habits and weaknesses of every white person who had power over her people. She started noticing things that had been invisible to her before. How the lock on the tool shed had a loose bolt that could be worked free with patience. How Mr. Grayson kept a flask of whiskey hidden behind the tobacco barn. How the stable boy sometimes left the barn doors unbarred when he was in a hurry to get to his own supper. But most important, she began to understand something about time itself, about how it moved differently for those who suffered and those who caused suffering. For Mr. Grayson and his kind, time was something to be filled with pleasures and distractions. For Evelyn, it had become something to be endured and shaped, a tool to be used with the same precision her tormentor used his pliers. The other slaves began to notice the change in her, though they might not have been able to put it into words. Where once she'd been a victim, pure and simple, now there was something else in her bearing. Not defeat, not even resignation, but a kind of terrifying patience that suggested she was waiting for something specific to happen. "That girl's got murder in her heart," whispered Aunt Sarah one evening, watching Evelyn tend the cooking fire with her ruined hands moving steady and sure among the flames. Murder and justice all mixed up together till you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. But it wasn't murder that lived in Evelyn's heart. Not exactly. It was something more complex than that. Something that combined justice and vengeance and a deep, abiding need to restore some kind of balance to a world that had been knocked off its axis. She'd been transformed by pain into something new. Something that hadn't existed before Mr. Grayson decided to use her for his sick education. The seasons turned again, spring into summer into autumn, and with each cycle Evelyn's knowledge deepened and her patience grew stronger. She was no longer the frightened child who'd held out her hands for the first beating. She was becoming something else entirely, something that could wait years if necessary, something that could plan and prepare and choose exactly the right moment to act. The nail-taking continued, regular as Sunday service, but now it served a different purpose. For Mr. Grayson, it was still about power and control and the sick pleasure he took in breaking spirits. For Evelyn, it had become a form of communion with something darker and more ancient than individual revenge. Each nail he took was another entry in a ledger that would someday be balanced. Each moment of pain was another lesson in the science of suffering that she would eventually put to good use. Each session was another step closer to the day when the student would become the teacher, when the victim would become the instrument of justice. Mr. Grayson thought he was creating a perfectly obedient slave. What he was actually creating was his own death, methodically and carefully crafted from the raw materials of cruelty and pain. And when that day finally came, when all the lessons had been learned and all the patience had been rewarded, it would be terrible and swift and absolutely just. Now comes the part of the story that's hardest to tell, child, because it's about the moment when you realize that evil ain't just one man with pliers and a twisted heart. Evil is a whole system, a whole way of thinking that infects everything it touches like poison in a well. And the worst part is how good people can get caught up in it, how they can convince themselves that what's wrong is right just because everybody else is doing it too. By the time Evelyn turned 14, word of Mr. Grayson's teaching methods had spread throughout the county like wildfire through dry grass. Other plantation owners started bringing their problem slaves, to Massa Thornfield's place, paying good money to have Mr. Grayson apply his special brand of correction. The plantation became a kind of school for breaking spirits, a place where white men came to learn the finer points of psychological and physical torture. The worst thing was how they talked about it, not like the monstrous evil it was, but like some kind of agricultural technique, a new method for improving crop yields or breeding better livestock. They'd stand around sipping whiskey and discussing the best approaches for correcting behavioral problems in their human property, comparing notes like farmers sharing tips about soil management. The key, Mr. Grayson would explain to his eager students, is consistency and escalation. Start small, a finger here, a toe there, but make sure they understand that worse is coming if they don't learn their lesson. The anticipation is almost as effective as the actual punishment. Evelyn became his star pupil in reverse, the perfect example of how to break down resistance through patient, methodical torture. They'd bring visitors to watch her sessions like it was some kind of educational demonstration, taking notes and asking questions about technique and timing. "Notice how she don't fight anymore," Mr. Grayson would say, gripping one of her thumbnails with his pliers. "That's what complete conditioning looks like. She knows resistance is futile, so she's learned to submit. That's the goal with all of them, complete psychological surrender." But what Mr. Grayson and his students couldn't see was that submission and surrender are two different things entirely. Evelyn had indeed stopped fighting, on the outside. Inside, where it mattered, she was waging a war unlike anything they could imagine, a campaign of mental and spiritual resistance that grew stronger with every nail they took. She'd learned to separate herself from her body during these sessions, to float above the scene and observe it with the detached curiosity of a scholar studying some fascinating but disturbing phenomenon. She watched the faces of the white men as they gathered around her suffering, saw the mixture of excitement and disgust and sexual arousal that they tried to hide behind masks of scientific interest. Most revealing was what happened after the sessions, when they thought she was too broken and exhausted to pay attention. They'd retire to the big house to drink and discuss what they'd witnessed, and their conversations revealed truths about themselves that they probably didn't even recognize. "Makes you feel powerful, don't it?" she heard one visitor say to another as they walked past the cabin where she lay recovering. "Seeing how much pain a human body can endure before it breaks makes you understand why God put us in charge of these people. We got the strength to do what's necessary." "Still," his companion replied, "seems almost wasteful to ruin a good worker just for the sake of making a point. Might be more profitable to find other ways to maintain discipline." That was when Evelyn understood the full scope of what she was dealing with. It wasn't just Mr. Grayson's individual sickness. It was an entire culture, an entire way of seeing the world that allowed good Christian men to rationalize the most unspeakable cruelties as long as they served the larger purpose of maintaining order and protecting profit. The system didn't sleep, didn't take breaks, didn't show mercy even to children. It operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, grinding up human souls and converting them into cotton and tobacco and sugar and wealth for people who would never dirty their own hands with the actual work. But systems, Evelyn was learning, have their own weaknesses. They become predictable, routine, vulnerable to anyone patient enough to study their patterns and smart enough to find the pressure points where a small action could cause maximum damage. She started paying attention to the conversations she overheard, the business discussions and political arguments that the white folks had when they thought no slaves were listening. She learned about cotton prices and shipping schedules, about debts and mortgages and the complex web of financial relationships that kept the plantation system running. Most important, she learned that the white folks were just as trapped in the system as the slaves were, just trapped at the top instead of the bottom. They were dependent on slave labor for their wealth, their status, their entire way of life. Take that away and their whole world would collapse like a house of cards. That knowledge was like finding a crack in the wall of a prison cell. Small at first, barely visible, but with the potential to be widened and exploited until the whole structure came tumbling down. The nail-taking sessions continued, But now they served a different purpose in Evelyn's mind. Each one was a gathering of intelligence, an opportunity to study her enemies and learn their weaknesses. She memorized faces, names, habits, connections. She filed away every scrap of information like a general preparing for a long and complicated war. The other slaves began to sense that something was different about these sessions, though they couldn't put their finger on what had changed. Evelyn still suffered, still bled, still endured the unimaginable pain of having her nails torn from her fingers again and again. But there was something in her bearing now, something that suggested she was getting something out of these encounters that her tormentors didn't intend to give. "That child's learning something," Uncle Moses observed one evening, watching Evelyn work in the kitchen with her bandaged hands moving sure and steady despite their obvious pain. "Don't know what it is, but she's learning it deep." The truth was that Evelyn was learning the most dangerous lesson of all, that the people who had power over her were not gods or demons or forces of nature. They were just men, flawed and frightened and vulnerable in ways they didn't even recognize. And men, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could be hurt, could be taught lessons of their own, could be made to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of systematic cruelty. The dreams came more frequently now, vivid scenarios where the roles were reversed and she was the teacher. In these dreams, she was patient and methodical, explaining each step of the process with the same calm professionalism that Mr. Grayson used. She was creating her own educational demonstrations, showing a different kind of audience what justice looked like when it was finally allowed to operate. Winter came early that year, bringing with it a cold that seemed to settle into the very bones of the plantation. The nail-taking sessions moved indoors, to a back room in the Overseer'S house where a fire could keep the white visitors warm while they watched the entertainment. But the change of venue also brought new opportunities for observation and planning. Evelyn learned the layout of the Overseer'S house, the location of doors and windows, the habits of the men who gathered there. She memorized which floorboards creaked, which locks were loose, which windows could be opened quietly in the dead of night. Knowledge accumulated like interest in a bank account, growing slowly but steadily toward some future moment when it would be time to make a withdrawal. And when that moment came, when all the preparation and patience and suffering finally reached their appointed purpose, the payment would be extracted with the same methodical precision that Mr. Grayson had taught her through 300 nights of agony. The system that had created and sustained her torment would learn that every action has consequences, that every cruelty plants seeds that eventually grow into something the perpetrators never expected to harvest. Justice was coming, slowly, patiently, inevitably, and when it arrived, it would be terrible to behold. Listen now, child, to what happened on that Tuesday morning in late October, when the leaves had turned the color of dried blood, and the air carried the promise of winter's first frost. This was the day when all the waiting and watching and learning finally came together like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across 15 long years of suffering. Evelyn woke before dawn with a stillness in her spirit that was different from any quiet she'd ever known. Not the emptiness of despair, not the numbness of repeated trauma, but something deeper and more purposeful. The calm that comes to a river just before it changes course and cuts a new channel through the landscape. She'd been planning this day for months, studying the patterns and routines that governed life on Massa Thornfield's plantation, with the patience of a spider weaving its web. She knew that Mr. Grayson would be expecting his regular Wednesday session with her, knew he'd been promising his latest group of visiting students a demonstration of his advanced techniques for maintaining discipline among the more stubborn slaves. But what Mr. Grayson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that yesterday had been the last time anyone would ever take a nail from Evelyn's hands. Yesterday had been the end of one story, and today would be the beginning of another darker tale that would be whispered in slave quarters across 3 states before the week was out. The morning started ordinary enough. Evelyn worked alongside her mama in the big house kitchen, preparing breakfast for the white folks while the eastern sky turned from black to gray to pale yellow. Her hands moved steady and sure despite their terrible scars, kneading biscuit dough and slicing bacon with the efficiency that came from years of practice. Asha watched her daughter work and sensed something different in her movements, something that made the older woman's heart flutter with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was part pride, part terror, part recognition that the child she'd carried in her womb had become something entirely new. Something that might be capable of actions that would change everything for everyone on the plantation. "You feeling all right this morning, baby?" Asha asked, her voice careful and quiet in the way of slave women who'd learned to communicate important things without seeming to say anything at all. "I'm feeling like today's gonna be different, Mama," Evelyn replied, not looking up from her work but speaking with a certainty that made the kitchen feel suddenly smaller and more charged with possibility. Like maybe it's time for some folks to learn lessons they've been needing to learn for a long time. Around mid-morning, when the breakfast dishes had been cleared and the white folks were settled in the parlor discussing business matters, Mr. Grayson sent word that Evelyn should report to the back room of his house for what he called continuing education. 3 visitors had arrived the night before, planters from plantations in Alabama and Mississippi, who'd heard about his methods and wanted to see them demonstrated firsthand. Evelyn received the summons with the same outward composure she'd shown for years, but inside her chest, something that had been coiled tight as a spring for most of her life finally began to loosen and prepare for release. She walked across the yard toward the Overseer'S house with measured steps, her scarred hands swinging loose at her sides, her face showing nothing of the fire that was building in her belly. The 3 visitors were already seated in chairs around the familiar wooden stool when she entered the back room. They were younger men than usual, probably sons of established planters being educated in the family business, and their eyes held that mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation that Evelyn had learned to recognize in first-time observers of Mr. Grayson's sessions. "Gentlemen," Mr. Grayson announced with the pride of a showman introducing his star performer, "I present to you the finest example of behavioral conditioning you'll find anywhere in the South. This girl here has received over 200 individual correction sessions, and as you'll see, she's learned to accept her place with perfect submission." He gestured toward the stool, and Evelyn took her usual position, placing her hands flat on the cutting block with movements that had become as automatic as breathing. But this time, as she positioned herself for what everyone in the room expected to be another routine demonstration of white power and black helplessness, she was running through a different kind of mental checklist. She noted the position of each man in the room, the distance to the door, the location of Mr. Grayson's collection of tools laid out on the nearby table. She measured the light coming through the single window, calculated the time it would take for screams to reach the big house, estimated how long she would have before help could arrive for whichever of these men would need it most. "Now watch closely," Mr. Grayson said, selecting his favorite pair of pliers from the array of instruments. "The key to effective conditioning is consistency of application. The subject must understand that resistance is not only futile, but will result in escalated consequences." He moved toward Evelyn with the casual confidence of a man who had performed this same ritual hundreds of times before, a man who had never once considered that his victim might be capable of anything other than passive acceptance of whatever he chose to inflict. In his mind, she was no more capable of rebellion than a hammer was capable of refusing to strike a nail. But as he reached for her left hand, something in Evelyn's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders squared slightly, her breathing deepened, and for just a moment, her eyes lifted from their customary downward gaze to meet his directly. In that brief contact, something passed between them, a recognition that the balance of power in that room was about to change in ways that would shock everyone present. "You know, Mr. Grayson," Evelyn said, her voice steady and conversational, "I've been thinking about something lately. Been thinking about what it might feel like to be on the other side of them pliers." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. The three visitors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unsure whether this was part of the usual routine or something entirely unexpected. Mr. Grayson himself froze with the pliers halfway to her hand, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard from someone he'd trained never to speak unless spoken to. "What did you say, girl?" His voice carried a warning that would have terrified the Evelyn of previous years, but had no effect whatsoever on the woman she'd become. "I said I've been wondering what it would feel like to teach instead of learn," she replied, her tone still calm but now carrying an undertone of something that made the room feel suddenly colder. "Been wondering what kind of sounds a white man makes when he's the one getting the education." That's when Mr. Grayson realized that something had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong with his perfectly controlled demonstration. The girl who had submitted to hundreds of sessions without resistance was looking at him now, with eyes that held no fear, no submission, no recognition of his authority. She was looking at him like a predator looks at prey, with the patience of something that has waited a very long time for exactly the right moment to strike. He tried to reassert control the only way he knew how, raising the pliers to strike her across the face for her insolence. But Evelyn was no longer the helpless child who had first sat on that stool 5 years ago. She was 15 now, strong from years of hard labor, quick from years of dodging blows, and most dangerous of all, she was no longer afraid of pain. Pain had become her teacher, her companion, her most intimate friend. The pliers never reached their target. Instead, they found themselves gripped in hands that had learned to endure anything, twisted away from their intended victim, and turned toward a new purpose that would demonstrate once and for all the difference between justice and revenge. The lesson that Mr. Grayson had been teaching for so many years was about to be taught in reverse, and the student who had learned it best was finally ready to graduate to teacher. The screaming that followed would be remembered by everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. But for the first time in the history of that back room, the screams would be coming from the right person. What happened next, child, ain't for the weak of heart or the tender of stomach. What Evelyn did in that back room of the Overseer'S house was justice wearing the mask of vengeance, retribution dressed up in the bloody clothes of necessity. Some might call it murder, others might call it long overdue correction, but I call it the moment when the chickens finally came home to roost in a hen house that had been painted with innocent blood for far too long. The first thing that died in that room wasn't Mr. Grayson. It was the illusion that white skin was armor against the consequences of evil. When Evelyn's hands closed around those pliers and twisted them away from her own flesh toward his, the natural order that he'd spent his life enforcing suddenly revealed itself to be nothing more than a convenient lie that could be shattered as easily as window glass. "Now then," Evelyn said in that same calm, conversational tone that Mr. Grayson had used for so many years, "I reckon it's time for you to learn what I've been learning all these years. Time for you to understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end of your own education." The three visiting planters scrambled toward the door like rats fleeing a burning barn, but Evelyn had planned for that possibility. The door was already barred from the inside, the key safely tucked away where no one would think to look for it. They were trapped in that room with her just like she'd been trapped in her own skin, with the pain they'd all come to witness and enjoy. "Sit down, gentlemen," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that none of them had ever heard from a slave before. "You came here for an education, and by God, you're gonna get one. You're gonna learn exactly what your money has been buying all these years." Mr. Grayson tried to reach for the pistol he kept in his belt, but his movements were clumsy with panic and confusion. He'd never imagined that his perfectly conditioned victim might be capable of resistance, much less of taking control of a situation he'd orchestrated hundreds of times before. The gun never cleared leather before Evelyn's scarred hand closed around his wrist with a grip that had been strengthened by years of gripping wooden handles and enduring unimaginable pain. "Oh no, sir," she said, taking the weapon and setting it carefully on the table next to his collection of torture implements. "We ain't gonna need that today. What we gonna need is these here pliers and maybe some of them other tools you've been so fond of showing off. Gonna give you a chance to see how they work from the other side." She forced him down onto the wooden stool where she'd sat for so many sessions, positioning his hands on the cutting block with movements that mirrored exactly what he'd done to her countless times before. The symmetry was perfect, beautiful in its terrible justice. The torturer in the victim's place, the teacher about to become the student in a curriculum that he himself had designed. "Please," Mr. Grayson whispered, and that single word carried more weight than all the screams that would follow. It was the first time he'd ever said please to a slave. The first time he'd ever acknowledged that someone he considered property might have the power to grant or deny mercy. "Please, I was just doing my job. I was just maintaining order." "Oh, I know exactly what you was doing," Evelyn replied, selecting the same pair of needle-nose pliers that he'd used on her just the day before. "You was teaching lessons about power and submission and knowing your place in the world. Well, Mr. Grayson, today you're gonna learn all about your place in my world." What followed was a careful, methodical demonstration of everything that Mr. Grayson had taught her about the science of inflicting pain. Evelyn worked with the same patient precision that he'd shown her, the same attention to detail, the same focus on making sure that each moment of agony served an educational purpose. But where his lessons had been about breaking spirits and enforcing submission, hers were about justice and the settling of accounts that had been too long outstanding. Each nail she took from his fingers was payment for one of hers. Each scream she drew from his throat was interest on a debt that had been accumulating for 5 years. "You understand now," she said as she worked, her voice maintaining that same calm, instructional tone that he'd used with his visiting students. "You understand what it feels like to be helpless, to be at the mercy of someone who don't believe you deserve mercy. You understand what it's like to have your body turned into someone else's classroom." The 3 visitors pressed themselves against the far wall, their faces pale with terror and disbelief. They'd come to see a demonstration of white power over black flesh, and instead they were witnessing something that overturned every assumption they'd ever made about the natural order of things. They were seeing a slave not just resist but dominate, not just fight back but take complete control of a situation that should have been impossible for her to influence. "Y'all just sit quiet now," Evelyn told them without looking away from her work. "Your turn's coming. Every man in this room came here to watch suffering, so you gonna watch it. Only difference is, today, you gonna watch the right person suffer." Mr. Grayson tried to maintain his authority even as his fingernails disappeared one by one. "You'll hang for this," he gasped between screams. "They'll hunt you down like a rabid dog and string you up from the nearest tree." "Maybe so," Evelyn agreed, pausing in her work to meet his eyes with a gaze that held no fear, no doubt, no regret. "But that'll be tomorrow's problem. Today's problem is you learning what you taught me. That pain is a language, and I'm about to make you fluent in it." As she continued her methodical work, something extraordinary happened in that room. The power dynamic that had governed every interaction between white and black on that plantation since its founding was not just reversed but completely obliterated. Mr. Grayson was no longer an overseer. He was just a man in agony, reduced to his most basic humanity by someone he'd tried to convince himself wasn't fully human at all. The 3 visitors were no longer masters observing the correction of property. They were witnesses to the collapse of everything they'd believed about their own superiority and safety. They were learning that the violence they'd taken for granted as their right to inflict could just as easily be turned against them by those they'd assumed were too broken to fight back. But most important of all, Evelyn was no longer a victim. She'd become something entirely new. An agent of justice in a world that had forgotten what justice looked like. A teacher in a classroom where the most important lessons had never been written in any book. When she finally finished with Mr. Grayson's hands, when the last nail had been taken and the last scream had echoed off the walls of that back room, she stood back to survey her work, with the satisfaction of an artist who'd finally completed a masterpiece she'd been planning for years. "Now then," she said, turning her attention to the 3 visitors who cowered against the wall like children hiding from a thunderstorm. "Who wants to be next? Who else wants to learn what their money has been buying all these years? The education that had started in that room 5 years ago was finally complete, but the graduation ceremony was just beginning, and before it was over, everyone present would understand exactly what it meant to reap what you sow. The student had become the teacher, and class was still in session. Child, what came after the screaming stopped was something that hadn't been heard in that room for all the years Mr. Grayson had been conducting his educational sessions. Silence. Not the awful quiet that follows unspeakable pain, but the deep, complete silence that falls over the world when justice finally arrives to collect a debt that's been too long outstanding. Mr. Grayson slumped on that wooden stool, his ruined hands clutched against his chest, his face gray as old ash. The arrogance that had carried him through hundreds of sessions with enslaved victims was gone, burned away by his own medicine administered with the precise dosage he'd taught Evelyn to calculate over 5 years of brutal instruction. But Evelyn wasn't finished. Not yet. The lesson she'd been planning in the secret corners of her mind during all those nights of pain and humiliation was far from complete. She'd learned from the master himself that education required more than just physical correction. It required understanding, acceptance, and most important of all, it required the student to acknowledge the truth of what they'd done. "You understand now, don't you, Mr. Grayson?" she asked, selecting a different tool from his collection with the casual expertise of someone who'd been forced to become intimately familiar with each instrument. "You understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end of what you've been dishing out all these years?" He tried to speak, but only a strangled moan emerged from his throat. Pain had taken away his voice just like it had taken away hers so many times, leaving him with nothing but the language of suffering that he'd taught her to speak so fluently. The 3 visitors pressed themselves against the wall, their eyes wide with a terror that went beyond mere fear of physical harm. They were witnessing something that challenged every assumption they'd ever made about the world, about power, about the natural order that put them at the top, and people like Evelyn at the bottom. They were seeing that order revealed as nothing more than a cruel fiction maintained by violence and the threat of violence. "Please," one of them finally whispered, his voice barely audible in the heavy air of the room. "Please, we ain't done nothing to you. We just came to watch." Evelyn turned her attention to the speaker, a young man probably no older than herself, with pale hair and eyes that had probably never seen real suffering before this moment. She studied him with the same careful attention that Mr. Grayson had always given to selecting his tools, measuring his fear and calculating exactly how much pressure would be needed to break him completely. "Just came to watch," she repeated, her voice carrying a note of dark amusement. "Just came to see a black woman get tortured for your entertainment. Just came to learn better ways to break the spirits of folks who look like me." She took a step toward him, and he pressed himself harder against the wall as if he could somehow disappear into the wood planks. "Tell me, mister, what's the difference between doing evil and paying to watch evil being done?" He opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out. How could he explain the distinction he'd always taken for granted? The comfortable distance that money and social position provided from the actual consequences of the system that enriched him. How could he make her understand that he wasn't personally responsible for the suffering he'd paid to observe, when he could see in her eyes that she understood the complicity perfectly? "That's what I thought," Evelyn said, turning back to Mr. Grayson. "Ain't got no answer for that, do you? 'Cause there ain't no difference. Evil is evil whether you do it with your own hands or pay someone else to do it for you." She selected a thin, curved blade from the collection of tools, one that Mr. Grayson had often used for what he called precision work. The metal caught the light from the window as she held it up, examining its edge with the critical eye of someone who'd learned to appreciate the craftsmanship that went into instruments of torture. "You know what this is for, don't you, Mr. Grayson?" she asked, moving closer to where he sat, hunched over his ruined hands. "You remember how you used to explain to your students that pain was just the beginning of a proper education? How the real learning happened when you got down to the deeper layers, the parts that don't heal so easy." Mr. Grayson's eyes went wide with a terror, that was beyond anything he'd ever inspired in his victims. He'd inflicted this particular form of correction on slaves who'd committed what he called serious infractions, and he knew exactly what she was planning to do with that blade. "Now you're gonna learn what I learned," Evelyn continued, her voice maintaining that same calm, instructional tone that made everything more terrifying. "You gonna learn that the human body can endure things that the human mind can't accept. You gonna learn that there's worse things than death, and some of them lessons take a real long time to teach proper." What happened next in that back room was justice wearing the mask of vengeance, retribution dressed in the bloody clothes of necessity. Evelyn worked with the methodical precision that Mr. Grayson himself had taught her, taking her time, making sure that each moment of agony served its educational purpose. The three visitors were forced to witness every moment of it, just as she'd been forced to endure every moment of her own suffering. They learned what it meant to be helpless observers of cruelty, to have their humanity tested by their inability to stop something they knew was wrong. They learned that complicity wasn't just about what you did. It was about what you failed to do, what you chose not to see, what you paid to have done in your name. But most important of all, they learned that the system they'd taken for granted could be turned inside out in the space of a single afternoon. They learned that the power they'd assumed was their birthright could be stripped away as easily as clothing, leaving them naked and vulnerable in the face of justice that wore a black woman's face and spoke with a black woman's voice. When Evelyn finally stepped back from her work, when the last lesson had been taught and the last debt had been paid, the room fell into that deep, complete silence that comes at the end of a long and terrible story. Mr. Grayson was still alive, barely, but he would never again be the man who'd walked into that room an hour ago. That man had died somewhere between the first scream and the last, replaced by something broken and hollow that would spend whatever remained of its life remembering what justice felt like when it finally arrived. The three visitors huddled against the wall, their fine clothes stained with sweat and terror, their minds struggling to process what they'd witnessed. They would carry this memory for the rest of their lives, this vision of their ordered world turned upside down by a woman who refused to accept that her suffering was the price of their prosperity. And Evelyn stood in the center of it all, her scarred hands steady, her breathing calm, her eyes holding a peace that she hadn't felt since childhood. The fire that had burned in her for 5 years had finally found its purpose, and the long account between herself and the world had been balanced at last. The teacher had become the student, the victim had become the judge, and justice had been served with the same methodical precision that cruelty had been inflicted. The lesson was complete, but the story was far from over. Now listen close, child, to what came after the silence, when the blood had stopped flowing and the screaming had died away to nothing but echoes in the walls of that back room. What happened next wasn't the end of the story, no sir. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would spread across the plantation like fire through dry grass and change everything for everyone who lived under Massa Thornfield's rule. Evelyn stood in the center of that room, her scarred hands steady at her sides, looking down at what remained of Mr. Grayson slumped on that wooden stool. The man who'd terrorized the quarters for so many years was nothing now but a broken thing, his body ruined by his own methods, his mind shattered by the experience of being on the receiving end of the cruelty he'd dealt out so freely. The three visitors pressed themselves against the wall like they was trying to disappear into the wood itself, their fine clothes soaked with sweat and terror, their eyes wide with the knowledge that they'd witnessed something that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. They'd come to see a demonstration of white power over black flesh, and instead they'd learned that power was just an illusion, a convenient lie that could be stripped away as easy as taking off a coat. "Y'all gonna go back to your plantations now," Evelyn said, her voice calm as Sunday morning but carrying an authority that made grown white men tremble like children. "You gonna go back and tell your friends and neighbors what you seen here today. You gonna tell them that the order they've been dependent on ain't as solid as they thought, that folks like me ain't as broken as they've been pretending to be." She moved to the door, turning the key in the lock with movements that was deliberate and unhurried. Freedom was right there, just on the other side of that door. But she wasn't running. Not yet. There was still work to be done. Still lessons to be taught. Still accounts to be settled. But first, she continued, turning back to face the three men who was huddled together like scared rabbits. Y'all gonna help me send a message to the big house. You gonna help me make sure that Massa Thornfield and his family understand exactly what's been happening in their overseer's back room all these years. The youngest of the three visitors, a pale boy with trembling hands and tears streaming down his cheeks, found his voice long enough to whisper, "What? What do you want us to do?" Evelyn smiled then, and it was a terrible thing to see. Not cruel exactly, but filled with a satisfaction that went deeper than simple revenge. It was the smile of someone who'd finally found the power to set things right after years of watching them go wrong. "You gonna carry him," she said, nodding toward the broken form of Mr. Grayson. "You gonna carry him up to that big house and lay him down right there on Massa Thornfield's front porch. You gonna tell whoever answers the door exactly what happened here, exactly how he got to be in such a sorry state." The three men looked at each other with the desperation of people who was caught between two impossible choices. They could refuse her orders and face whatever consequences she might inflict, or they could follow her instructions and face the wrath of a plantation owner whose overseer had just been destroyed by a slave. "Please," the youngest one begged. "They'll kill us for this. They'll think we was part of it, that we helped you somehow." "Maybe they will," Evelyn agreed, her voice showing no sympathy for their predicament. "But that ain't my concern. My concern is making sure the truth gets told. Making sure folks understand what's been happening in this room all these years while they was sipping their mint juleps and counting their profits." She moved to the table where Mr. Grayson's collection of torture implements was laid out like surgical instruments, selecting a few key pieces and wrapping them carefully in a piece of cloth. "You gonna give these to Massa Thornfield too. You gonna tell him they came from his overseer's special collection, the tools he used to educate the children in the quarters. You gonna make sure he understands exactly what kind of man he had working for him." The implications of what she was asking them to do hung heavy in the air of that room. By carrying Mr. Grayson to the big house, by delivering those tools and telling that story, the three visitors would be destroying their own reputations, admitting their complicity in something that even the most hardened plantation owners might find difficult to stomach. But they also understood, in the deepest part of their fear-addled minds, that refusing her was not an option. The woman who stood before them was no longer the helpless victim they'd come to watch suffer. She was something new and dangerous, something that had been forged in the fires of systematic torture and emerged harder and more terrible than anything they could have imagined. With shaking hands and whispered prayers, they lifted what remained of Mr. Grayson from the stool and began the long walk to the big house. The overseer was still breathing, but barely, his consciousness floating in and out like a tide that couldn't make up its mind which way to flow. Evelyn followed behind them, not to make sure they completed their task. She knew they would, knew that fear would drive them to do exactly what she'd told them. But to witness the moment when the comfortable illusions of the big house came crashing down around the ears of those who'd built their lives on other people's suffering. The walk across the plantation yard felt like a journey through a different world, a place where the normal rules had been suspended and new ones was being written in blood and terror. Slaves working in the kitchen garden stopped their labor to stare as the strange procession passed, their eyes widening as they recognized what was happening. Word spread faster than wildfire. The overseer was down, broken, carried by white men who looked like they'd seen the devil himself. When they reached the front porch of the big house, the youngest visitor set down his burden with shaking hands and rang the brass bell that summoned the household staff. The door opened to reveal Samuel, the head butler, whose composed expression cracked like ice when he saw what was laid out on his master's porch. "Sweet Jesus," Samuel whispered, his eyes taking in the ruined form of Mr. Grayson and the blood-stained clothes of the three white men. "What in the Lord's name happened here?" Before any of the visitors could answer, Evelyn stepped forward from the shadows where she'd been watching. Her presence on the front porch of the big house was itself a violation of every rule that governed plantation life. But rules seemed like small things now in the face of what had just transpired. "Go get your master, Samuel," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd just shifted the balance of power on the entire plantation. "Tell him his overseer's been educated in some of the lessons he's been teaching to the children in the quarters. Tell him it's time for a conversation about what's been happening in that back room all these years." Samuel's eyes went wide with terror and disbelief. In all his years as a house slave, he'd never heard a field hand speak to him with such authority. Never imagined a scenario where a black woman could stand on the master's porch and issue commands to white men and expect them to be obeyed. But he could see in Evelyn's bearing and the way the three visitors cowered before her that something fundamental had changed in the order of things. The woman who stood before him was no longer a slave in any meaningful sense of the word. She'd become something else entirely, something that commanded respect through sheer force of will, and the terrible knowledge that she was no longer afraid to use violence to get what she wanted. "Yes'm," Samuel heard himself say, the words coming out before his mind could catch up with what his mouth was doing. I'll go get Massa Thornfield right away." As he disappeared into the house, Evelyn looked down at the broken form of Mr. Grayson and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, and not satisfaction in the way most people understood it, but a deep, abiding sense that justice had been served and balance had been restored to a world that had been tilted wrong for far too long. The price would be terrible, she knew that. They would hunt her now with dogs and guns and all the fury that white folks could muster when their illusions of superiority was stripped away. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, for the first time in her life, she was free, not just from chains and overseers, but from the fear that had kept her spirit locked away in the dark corners of her heart. The reckoning had begun, and there would be no going back. "Child." When Massa Thornfield finally came out onto that porch and saw what was waiting for him there, his face went through more changes than the sky during a summer storm. First came confusion, then recognition, then a kind of cold fury that would have frozen the blood of any slave who'd ever lived under his rule. But Evelyn stood there steady as stone, watching him take in the scene, his broken overseer, the terrified visitors, the collection of torture implements laid out like evidence in a courtroom where justice had finally found its voice. "What in the hell is the meaning of this?" Massa Thornfield demanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never been contradicted, never been challenged, never been forced to confront the true nature of what happened on his plantation when he wasn't looking. The youngest of the three visitors, his voice shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, began to stammer out an explanation that made less sense with every word. But before he could finish painting himself as an innocent bystander, caught up in circumstances beyond his control, Evelyn stepped forward and spoke with a clarity that cut through his babbling like a knife through butter. "Your overseer been using them tools to torture children in the quarters," she said, her voice steady and clear as church bells on Sunday morning. "Been pulling fingernails and toenails from little ones who ain't done nothing wrong except be born into slavery. These gentlemen here came to watch, came to learn his methods so they could take them back to their own plantations." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, heavy and poisonous and impossible to ignore. Massa Thornfield's face went pale, then red, then pale again as the implications of what she was saying settled into his mind. He was a cruel man, certainly, and a greedy one, but he prided himself on running what he called a civilized operation, one that maintained discipline without descending into what he considered unnecessary brutality. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Grayson is an experienced overseer. He knows how to maintain discipline without resorting to..." His words trailed off as his eyes fell on the collection of pliers and blades laid out on his porch. Tools that no legitimate plantation operation would need. Instruments designed for one purpose only. The evidence was right there in front of him, impossible to deny or explain away. "Show him your hands, girl," one of the visitors suddenly blurted out, desperate to shift attention away from his own complicity. "Show him what his overseer done to you all these years." Evelyn raised her hands slowly, turning them palm up so that Massa Thornfield could see the full extent of the damage that had been inflicted in his name. The scars were horrific, the fingernails grown back thick and twisted, the skin mottled with old injuries that spoke of systematic, repeated torture. For a long moment, the master of Thornfield Plantation stared at those ruined hands in silence. He was seeing, perhaps for the first time, the true cost of the order he'd maintained, the price that had been paid in flesh and blood and childhood innocence for his comfortable life in the big house. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. How long has this been going on?" 5 years, Evelyn answered simply. "Started when I was 8 years old. 300 sessions, more or less. These gentlemen here paid good money to watch some of them, learn techniques they could take back home and use on their own people." The 3 visitors shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their attempt to use Evelyn's testimony to save themselves had backfired spectacularly. They were being revealed not as innocent witnesses but as paying customers in a system of organized torture, men who'd traveled hundreds of miles to watch children suffer for their entertainment and education. Massa Thornfield's eyes moved from the broken form of his overseer to the faces of his visitors, to the steady gaze of the slave woman who stood before him without fear or deference. In that moment, he understood that his world had been turned upside down, that everything he thought he knew about the order of things had been revealed as a lie, built on unspeakable cruelty. "What do you want?" he asked Evelyn, his voice hoarse with something that might have been shame or might have been rage. "What is it you think you can accomplish by this madness?" Evelyn smiled then, and it was a smile that contained multitudes, pain and wisdom, and a terrible kind of satisfaction that came from finally being in a position to speak truth to power. "I don't want nothing from you that you can give," she said. "I already took what I needed. What I want now is for you to understand what you've been allowing to happen on your land, in your name, under your authority." She gestured toward the 3 visitors who had pressed themselves against the porch railing, as if they could somehow escape through the white-painted wood. "These men came here to learn how to break children, how to turn little ones into perfectly obedient property. They paid Mr. Grayson for the privilege of watching him tear fingernails from 8-year-old girls. That's what your civilized plantation been selling, Massa Thornfield. That's the business you've been running without even knowing it." The master's face went through another series of changes as the full scope of what had been happening under his roof settled into his understanding. He'd prided himself on being different from the most brutal plantation owners, on maintaining discipline through what he considered reasonable means. The discovery that his overseer had been running what amounted to a torture school on his property was devastating to his self-image as a civilized gentleman. "Mr. Grayson exceeded his authority," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "He will be dealt with appropriately. And you, gentlemen," he turned toward the visitors, "will remove yourselves from my property immediately and never return." But Evelyn shook her head, her expression showing no satisfaction with this response. "Ain't enough," she said simply. "Ain't near enough. You can't just punish one man and pretend like the system that allowed this to happen don't need changing. You can't just send these men home and hope they forget what they learned here." She took a step closer to Massa Thornfield, and for the first time in his life, he found himself backing away from a slave. There was something in her bearing now that commanded respect, something that made it impossible to see her as property, rather than as a human being with agency and power and the ability to demand justice. "What's gonna happen now," she continued, "is you gonna watch me walk off this plantation. You gonna watch me head north toward freedom, and you ain't gonna send dogs after me, and you ain't gonna put bounties on my head, and you ain't gonna try to track me down and bring me back." The audacity of her demand struck everyone present like a physical blow. Slaves didn't negotiate with masters, didn't make demands or set terms for their departure. They ran in secret and prayed they wouldn't be caught, or they lived in fear and hoped for eventual manumission. "And if I refuse?" Massa Thornfield asked, his voice barely controlled. Evelyn's smile widened, becoming something truly terrifying to behold. "Then what happened to Mr. Grayson gonna seem like mercy compared to what I do to you and your family? I learned everything he had to teach about causing pain, Massa Thornfield. Everything and more. You want to test whether I'm willing to use that knowledge on the folks sleeping in this big house?" The threat hung in the air between them like a loaded gun, heavy with the promise of violence that would make what had happened to the overseer look like a gentle correction. And Massa Thornfield, looking into Evelyn's eyes, saw something that convinced him she was entirely capable of carrying out her threat. For the first time in his life, he was afraid of one of his slaves. And that fear would change everything that came after. Now I'm coming to the end of this tale, child, but like all true stories about pain and justice and the price of freedom, the ending ain't clean and simple like them fairy tales white folks tell their children. Real life don't tie up neat with pretty ribbons and happy ever after. Real life is messy and complicated, and sometimes the price of justice is higher than anybody wants to pay. Evelyn walked off that plantation on a Tuesday morning in late October, with the autumn sun painting the world in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the blood that had been spilled in that back room. She walked steady and deliberate, her scarred hands swinging at her sides, her head held high for the first time since childhood. Behind her, the quarters was buzzing with whispered conversations and wide-eyed stares, slave folks who couldn't quite believe what they'd heard, what one of their own had managed to accomplish. Massa Thornfield stood on his front porch, watching her go, his face a mask of rage and humiliation, and something that might have been respect. He'd given his word that she could leave unmolested, and despite every instinct that told him to set the dogs loose and hunt her down like a runaway animal, he kept that word. Maybe it was fear that held him back, or maybe it was the knowledge that some debts can only be paid in full, never partial payment accepted. The story spread faster than wildfire through the slave quarters of 3 counties. The tale of the girl who'd turned the tables on her tormentor, who'd used his own methods against him and walked away free. Some versions made her into a conjure woman with supernatural powers. Others painted her as an angel of vengeance sent by God to settle accounts. But every version carried the same essential truth, that the power structure they'd all learned to accept as unchangeable could be overturned, that victims could become victors if they was willing to pay the price. Evelyn herself made it to the Underground Railroad within a week, following the North Star and the coded songs that led runaway slaves to freedom. The conductors who helped her along the way said she was different from other freedom seekers they'd aided. She didn't look back with longing or forward with desperate hope. She moved through the world like someone who'd already found what she was looking for, who'd already settled the most important account of her life. But freedom, when you've paid such a terrible price for it, don't taste quite like what you expect. Evelyn found herself in Philadelphia, working in a boarding house for abolitionists, surrounded by good people who wanted to help, but couldn't quite understand what she'd been through. They saw her scars, heard pieces of her story, and tried to offer comfort and healing. But how do you heal from something that was never meant to be healed? How do you forget lessons that was carved into your very soul? Late at night, when the boarding house was quiet and the city slept around her, Evelyn would sit by the window and think about what she'd left behind. Not the plantation. She felt no nostalgia for that place of suffering. But the people still trapped there, still enduring what she'd escaped. Her mama Asha still working in that kitchen, still carrying the weight of loss and fear. The other children growing up under the shadow of whips and chains and the terrible knowledge that their bodies belonged to someone else. She'd saved herself, but she hadn't saved them. Couldn't save them. That knowledge sat heavy in her chest like a stone that wouldn't dissolve, wouldn't be digested, wouldn't be forgotten. The abolitionists wanted to use her story, wanted her to speak at meetings and tell audiences of sympathetic white folks about the horrors of slavery. But every time she tried to find words for what she'd experienced, she came up against the simple truth that some things can't be shared, can't be explained to people who ain't lived them. The pain was hers alone to carry, just like the satisfaction of revenge was hers alone to savor. Years passed. The war came, as everyone knew it would, and with it the promise that slavery might finally die the death it deserved. Evelyn watched from her window in Philadelphia as young men marched off to fight and die for causes they barely understood, and she wondered if any of them truly comprehended what they was fighting for. The right of every human being to own their own flesh, to make their own choices, to live without fear of the whip and the auction block. When news came that the plantation system was crumbling, that former slaves was walking free across the South, Evelyn felt a satisfaction that was deeper than personal victory. She'd struck the first blow in a war that was finally being won, had proven that the system could be fought, could be beaten, could be brought down by people who refused to accept that their suffering was the natural order of things. But with that satisfaction came a loneliness that no amount of freedom could heal. She'd become something unique in the world, someone who'd crossed lines that most people never even see, who'd done things that separated her forever from normal human company. The other former slaves she met couldn't quite understand her hardness, her lack of forgiveness, her unwillingness to put the past behind her and move forward into whatever future was being born. She was a bridge between worlds, between slavery and freedom, between victimhood and vengeance, between the person she'd been and the person she'd become. But bridges, for all their usefulness, are lonely places to spend a life. On quiet evenings, when the weight of memory pressed down too heavy, Evelyn would take out a small cloth bag she kept hidden in her room. Inside was a collection of fingernails, her own, saved from the times when they'd grown back crooked and she'd had to trim them down. She'd kept them as reminders, as proof that she'd survived what should have killed her, that she'd turned her wounds into weapons. But there was also something else, and they was promises. Promises to the children still suffering, still learning to endure what shouldn't be endured. Promises that their pain wouldn't be forgotten, that someone who understood would remember and carry their stories forward into whatever future was coming. Because that's what survivors do, child. They remember. They carry the weight of what happened so that others don't have to. They tell the stories that need telling even when, especially when, those stories are too hard for comfortable folks to hear. Evelyn lived to be an old woman, died in her bed in Philadelphia surrounded by people who cared for her but never quite understood her. But before she passed, she made sure to pass along the stories, to teach the lessons that had been carved into her soul by pain and tempered by time. She made sure that what had happened to her, what she'd done in response, would be remembered. The people who suffered, suffered. Those who resisted left memory, and that memory lives on, carried in the voices of those who refuse to let the truth be buried, who insist that justice has a long arm and an even longer memory. The scars remain, child. They always remain. But they ain't just marks of what was done. They're proof of what was survived, what was overcome, what was transformed from wound into weapon into wisdom. Those who suffered, suffered. Those who resisted left memory, and memory we keep here, in the scars of captivity.